Imagine walking into a place where reputation means nothing. No one knows your name. No one cares where you've been. And whatever you've achieved stays outside. There's no spotlight here, no introductions, no advantage. Just presence. The air feels different. Not tense, but aware. Like every movement is being noticed. Even if no one says a word. You take a step forward, then another. And that's when you feel it. Not fear, not danger. Attention. Across the room. Someone is watching. Not aggressively, not obviously, but intentionally. The kind of attention that doesn't chase, it waits. And somehow, that feels heavier. You don't look immediately, not because you're afraid, but because something tells you this moment matters. Most people in situations like this would react quickly. They'd try to assert themselves, fill the silence, prove something. But what if you didn't? What if, instead of reacting, you observed? What if calm was your first response? That's where things begin to change, because pressure doesn't always come with noise. Sometimes, it arrives quietly. A look, a pause, a shift in space. And the real question isn't who's stronger. It's who understands the moment better. Now imagine someone who has spent years preparing for high-pressure scenes. Not in real life, but through discipline, repetition, and controlled environments. Someone like Keanu Reeves. Known for his focus and preparation in films like John Wick, he represents something different. Not dominance, not aggression, but control. So what happens when someone like that steps into a space where none of that background matters? No recognition, no assumptions, just presence, meeting presence. Does calm hold, or does pressure force a reaction? And more importantly, what does silence reveal when two people refuse to break it first? Because sometimes the most important moment in a room isn't the loudest one, it's the quietest. And right now, that moment is just beginning. This isn't about violence. It never was. What you're witnessing here isn't a confrontation. In the traditional sense, it's something far more subtle. Pressure. The kind that doesn't announce itself. The kind that doesn't need noise to be felt. Because in certain environments, people don't always test you with force. Sometimes, they test you with presence. With silence. With the way they occupy space. It's not about what they do. It's about what they don't do. No sudden movements. No direct challenge. Just a quiet question hanging in the air. Who are you? When nothing is said. Moments like this happen more often than people realize. Not just in intense settings, but in everyday life. A meeting. Room where no one speaks, but everyone is judging. A social space where one person shifts the entire mood without trying. A situation where you feel watched, without ever being addressed. And in those moments, most people react. Not always physically, but internally. Heart rate rises, breathing changes, thoughts speed up. You start calculating, overthinking, preparing for something that hasn't even happened. That's how pressure works. It doesn't attack you. It invites you to lose control. And that's where discipline becomes visible. Not the kind of discipline people show in public, but the quiet kind. The kind that shows up in stillness. Now think about someone like Keanu Reeves. Over the years, he's become known not just for his roles, but for the way he approaches them. In films like John Wick, his performances feel controlled, precise. But what many people overlook is what goes into that preparation. Training, repetition, focus. Not to become aggressive, but to become consistent. And more importantly, to remain calm under pressure. It's been said in interviews that he values discipline over intensity, that he prefers control over chaos. And while those skills are developed for film, the mindset behind them is very real. Because staying calm isn't something you switch on in the moment. It's something you build over time, breath by breath, choice by choice. So when someone, like that, enters a space where tension exists, even silently, they don't rush to react. They don't try to dominate the room. They observe. They listen, not just to what's happening around them, but to what's happening within. Because the real challenge in moments like this isn't the other person. It's yourself. Can you stay steady when your instincts tell you to respond? Can you remain present when your mind tries to escape the moment? Can you hold your ground without needing to prove it? That's the difference most people miss. They think pressure is something external, something coming at them. But in reality, pressure reveals what's already inside. And in a space like this, where nothing is being said, but everything is being felt, that truth becomes impossible to ignore. No audience, no validation, just awareness, and the quiet realization that how you respond in this moment says more about you than anything you could ever say out loud. The distance between them didn't disappear. It narrowed, slowly. Not enough for anyone else in the room to notice, but enough to be felt. A shift in space, a subtle adjustment in attention, the kind of movement that doesn't draw eyes, but changes everything. Across the room, the presence remained steady, unrushed, unforced, watching, but not staring, testing, but not pushing. And that's what made it different. There was no obvious challenge, no signal, no words exchanged. Just a quiet question forming in real time. Will you react, or will you remain? Moments like this aren't about action. They're about awareness. Every small detail begins to matter. The way someone stands, the angle of their shoulders, the rhythm of their breathing, even silence, starts to feel louder. Most people don't realize how much they reveal when nothing is happening. A slight shift of weight, a glance held for half a second too long, a breath taken just a little too quickly. These are the things that give you away. Not to everyone, but to someone who is paying attention, and in this moment, attention is everything. The room itself hasn't changed. People are still moving, still talking quietly, still existing in their own worlds. But between these 2 points of presence, something is building. Not tension in the dramatic sense. Something quieter, more controlled, like a conversation that isn't being spoken, but fully understood. One side tests space, not aggressively, just enough to see what happens. A step that closes distance slightly, a pause that lingers just a moment longer. It's not confrontation, it's observation in motion. And the response? Nothing. Immediate, no sudden reaction, no attempt to match or mirror, just stillness, but not passive stillness. Aware stillness, the kind that doesn't freeze. It chooses not to move, and that choice is where the balance begins to shift. Because when one person expects a reaction and doesn't receive it, something changes internally. Doubt, curiosity, recalibration. The rhythm they expected doesn't exist, and now they have to adjust. This is where most people misunderstand pressure. They think it's about who acts first, who speaks first, who moves first. But often, the real control lies with the one who doesn't. Someone like Keanu Reeves has built a reputation around controlled presence in films like John Wick, not because of speed or intensity alone, but because of timing. Knowing when to move and when not to. And in a moment like this, that distinction matters more than anything, because reacting too early gives away intention. Reacting too late shows hesitation. But choosing not to react at all, that creates uncertainty. And uncertainty is something most people aren't comfortable with. The air feels slightly heavier now, not tense, just focused. Like the space itself is waiting to see what happens next. Another small shift, barely noticeable, but intentional, the kind of movement that asks a question without needing words. And still, no reaction. Just breath, steady, controlled, unchanged. The kind of calm that doesn't try to prove anything. It simply exists, and that's when it becomes clear. This isn't building toward conflict. It's revealing something else entirely. Control isn't about dominating the moment. It's about understanding it before it unfolds. And right now, one side is beginning to realize that this moment isn't theirs to control. And then, something changed. Not suddenly, not dramatically, quietly. So quietly that to anyone else in the room, nothing had happened at all. But in that narrow space between awareness and reaction, the balance shifted. It started with something small, a slight adjustment in posture. A barely noticeable repositioning of weight, not defensive, not aggressive, intentional. The kind of movement that doesn't demand attention but redefines the moment. Because sometimes control isn't about what you do, it's about what you allow. The space remained the same, the distance unchanged, and yet, it felt different. More defined, more understood. Like invisible boundaries had been drawn, not with force, but with clarity. Across the room, that presence paused, just for a fraction longer than before, long enough to notice. Something wasn't aligning with expectation. The rhythm had changed. Before, there had been a pattern, a silent exchange. Test, observe, adjust. But now, that pattern didn't hold. And when patterns break, people hesitate. Not because they're unsure of themselves, but because the situation no longer follows familiar rules. This is where subtlety becomes powerful. Because the shift wasn't in movement alone. It was in meaning. A calm presence when consistent starts to communicate something deeper. Not resistance, not challenge, but certainty, and certainty doesn't need to be loud. Someone like Keanu Reeves has often been recognized for this kind of controlled energy in films like John Wick, not exaggerated, not overplayed, just precise. Every movement measured, every pause intentional. And while those performances are crafted for the screen, they reflect a principle that extends far beyond it. Clarity in action comes from clarity in mind. In this moment, that clarity became visible, not through dominance, but through stillness that didn't break. Another subtle shift followed, not forward, not backward, just enough to realign position, to make one thing clear. Without saying it, this space is understood. No escalation, no reaction, just awareness, expressed physically. And that's when something interesting happened. The pressure didn't increase. It softened. Not completely, but enough to feel the difference. Because pressure relies on response. It feeds on movement, on reaction, on emotional shifts. But when none of that appears, it loses direction. The question that once existed, will you react, began to fade, replaced by something else. Why aren't you reacting? And that question changes everything. Because now, the focus shifts inward from testing another person to reassessing yourself. That's the moment where control becomes undeniable. Not because something was won, but because something was understood. The environment hadn't changed. No one stepped in. No one interrupted. Life around them continued as normal. But within that quiet exchange, a conclusion had already formed, not spoken, not acknowledged, just recognized. The need to test further disappeared, not out of defeat, but out of realization, because when someone shows consistency and calm, it removes uncertainty. And without uncertainty, there's nothing left to challenge. The space reset itself, naturally, effortlessly, as if the moment had served its purpose and quietly moved on. And the most important part? No one else noticed. No reaction, no spectacle, no visible outcome. Just two individuals, returning to stillness. But one thing was different now. The question that started it all no longer existed, not because it was answered out loud, but because it didn't need to be. The shift had already said everything, and in that silence, the moment reached its conclusion, not through action, but through understanding. But here's what most people completely misunderstand. If a moment like this were captured, clipped, and shared online, it wouldn't be seen the way it actually happened. It would be simplified, reduced, turned into something easier to label. Within minutes, the comments would start, "Who won? Why didn't he react? He should have done something." That looked weak, because online, silence is often mistaken for hesitation. Calm is misunderstood as a lack of confidence and restraint. That's almost always labeled as inaction, but that interpretation misses the entire point. Moments like this aren't about winning. They're not even about confrontation. They're about awareness, about recognizing what a situation actually requires. Instead of reacting based on impulse, the internet thrives on clear outcomes. Win or lose, strong or weak, right or wrong. But real life doesn't work that way, especially in situations built on subtle pressure. Because what happened in that room wasn't a contest. There was no scoreboard, no audience deciding the outcome, just two people navigating a moment. And one of them chose something most people overlook: control. Someone like Keanu Reeves is often associated with intensity because of roles in films like John Wick. But what those roles quietly emphasize, and what audiences sometimes miss, isn't just action, it's discipline, timing, restraint, knowing when not to move. And that's exactly the kind of detail that gets lost online, because it's not dramatic. It doesn't create instant excitement, doesn't give people something obvious to react to, so instead, it gets rewritten, turned into something louder, something more exaggerated. A quiet moment becomes a face-off. A pause becomes tension building, stillness becomes waiting to strike, and suddenly the entire meaning changes. But that version isn't real, it's just easier to consume. The truth is, most people aren't trained to recognize composure. They're trained to notice reaction, movement, noise, anything that signals change. So when they see someone remain calm under pressure, it feels unfamiliar, even uncomfortable, because it challenges expectation. We're used to thinking strength looks aggressive, that confidence must be visible, that control should be obvious. But in reality, it often looks like nothing at all. Just a person standing still, breathing evenly, choosing not to engage. And that choice is where everything shifts. But online, that doesn't translate well, because it doesn't give immediate satisfaction. It doesn't answer the question people want answered: who came out on top? And maybe that's the problem. Because the need to define a winner comes from a limited way of seeing situations. It assumes every moment is a competition, that every interaction needs an outcome. But what if it doesn't? What if the real value of a moment like this isn't in what happened externally, but in what didn't happen internally? No loss of control, no unnecessary reaction, no escalation, just awareness, maintained from beginning to end. That's not weakness, that's discipline, and discipline isn't always easy to recognize from the outside, especially in a world that rewards instant reactions. Fast responses, emotional expression, because staying calm, truly calm, requires something different. It requires patience, clarity, and the ability to resist what feels natural in the moment. So when people online say, nothing happened, they're right, nothing visible happened, but internally, everything did. A decision was made, a reaction was controlled, a moment that could have escalated, didn't, and that outcome matters more than any visible action ever could, because it reflects something deeper, not skill. Not dominance, but understanding. Understanding of self, understanding of space, understanding of timing, and most importantly, understanding that not every situation needs to be answered. Some just need to be handled, quietly, without attention, without validation. So the next time a moment like this appears, and people rush to define it, it's worth asking a different question. Not who won, but who stayed in control. Because in situations like this, that's the only outcome that truly matters, and it's the one most people don't even notice. Now slow everything down. Not the situation, but your understanding of it. Because this is the part most people skip. The quiet part. The part where nothing dramatic happens, yet everything meaningful begins to settle. Take a breath and think about what you just witnessed. No raised voices. No sudden movement. No visible outcome. And still, it felt significant. Why? Because moments like this don't test your strength. They test your control, and control isn't something you prove to others. It's something you maintain within yourself. Strength isn't loud. It doesn't need to announce itself. It doesn't rush to be seen. In fact, the more real it is, the less it tries to show. Confidence isn't aggressive. It doesn't push into spaces unnecessarily. It doesn't react just to be acknowledged. It stays grounded, present, unshaken by what's happening around it. And real discipline? It doesn't need witnesses. It doesn't perform. It doesn't wait for validation. It simply exists, whether anyone notices or not. Someone like Keanu Reeves is often associated with calm presence, especially through roles like John Wick. But beyond the screen, what stands out isn't just performance, it's consistency. The idea that discipline isn't something you switch on when things get difficult. It's something you carry into every situation. Because the truth is, anyone can stay calm when things are easy, when there's no pressure, no tension, no uncertainty. But when something shifts, even slightly, that's when your habits show. Not your intentions, not what you wish you would do, but what you've practiced, what you've repeated, what you've built over time. And that's why moments like this matter. Not because of what happens externally, but because of what they reveal internally. Think about your own life. Not a dramatic situation, not an extreme one, just something simple. A conversation that didn't go the way you expected, a moment where someone tested your patience, a situation where you felt pressure building, even if no one else could see it. What did you do? Did you react immediately? Did you try to control the outcome? Or did you pause? Even briefly. Long enough to choose your response instead of being pulled into it. Because that pause is where discipline lives. It's small, almost invisible, but it changes everything. It creates space, and in that space, you get to decide, not based on emotion, not based on instinct alone, but based on awareness. That's the difference. Most people live in reaction. They move as soon as something happens. They speak as soon as they feel something. They respond without ever stepping back. And over time, that becomes automatic, a pattern, one that feels natural, but often leads to outcomes they didn't intend. But discipline interrupts that pattern, not by force, but by presence, by creating a moment of stillness before action. And that stillness is where control is built. It doesn't mean doing nothing, it means choosing when to do something. And just as importantly, choosing when not to. That's what you saw in that moment. Not avoidance, not hesitation, but choice. Clear, intentional, unrushed. And that's why it matters. Because in a world that constantly pushes for faster reactions, louder responses, stronger displays, the ability to remain calm becomes rare. And anything rare becomes powerful. Not in a visible way, not in a way that draws attention, but in a way that changes outcomes, quietly, consistently, without needing recognition. So the next time you find yourself in a moment of pressure, no matter how small, remember this: you don't have to react immediately. You don't have to prove anything. You don't have to match the energy in front of you. You have another option. Pause, breathe, observe, and then decide. Because the real measure of strength isn't in how you act under pressure. It's in whether you let that pressure decide for you, or whether you remain the one in control. And this is where everything becomes clear, not in the moment itself, but in what remains after it. Because when a situation like that passes, when the silence returns to normal, when the room continues as if nothing happened, most people move on without thinking twice. They look for something more obvious, more dramatic, more conclusive. But the truth is, the most important part of that moment was never meant to be seen. It was meant to be understood, not by everyone, just by the one experiencing it. Because strength in its real form doesn't always leave evidence. It doesn't always create a story that others can point to and say, that's where everything changed. Sometimes, the change is internal, quiet, almost invisible, but lasting. Someone like Keanu Reeves often represents this idea in a subtle way, not just through roles like John Wick, but through the way calm presence is portrayed, not as something dramatic, but as something consistent, reliable, unshaken. And that's what separates perception from reality. Because from the outside, people might say, nothing happened. No reaction, no confrontation, no clear outcome. But from the inside, everything happened. A choice was made. Not to react impulsively, not to match pressure with pressure, but to remain steady. And that choice, simple as it may seem, is what defines real strength. Not the ability to overpower a situation, but the ability to understand it before responding. Because when you understand a moment clearly, you don't feel the need to control it. You don't rush to prove something. You don't get pulled into unnecessary conflict. You simply remain. And that changes everything. Because most situations in life aren't as complicated as they seem. They feel intense in the moment. They feel urgent, like something must be done immediately. But often, that urgency is an illusion, created by emotion, amplified by expectation, and reinforced by habit. We're used to reacting quickly, answering immediately, defending ourselves without pause, because it feels natural. It feels like strength. But real strength is often the opposite. It's the ability to slow down when everything around you is speeding up, to stay grounded when pressure tries to pull you out of balance, to remain clear when emotions try to cloud your judgment. And that's not easy. It takes practice, awareness, and a willingness to do something that feels uncomfortable at first. Nothing. Not permanently, not passively, but intentionally. To choose stillness over reaction, to choose observation over assumption, to choose control over impulse. Because once you learn to do that, even for a few seconds, you start to see things differently. You notice details you would have missed. You understand situations more clearly. You respond in ways that are measured, instead of automatic. And over time, that becomes who you are. Not someone who reacts to pressure, but someone who understands it. And when you reach that point, something interesting happens. The need to prove yourself disappears. Not because you don't care, but because you no longer rely on external validation. You don't need others to recognize your strength. You don't need situations to confirm it. You already know. And that quiet confidence is what truly stands out. Not loudly, not obviously, but consistently, in the way you carry yourself, in the way you respond, in the way you choose not to engage when engagement isn't necessary. That's what makes the difference. Not just in intense moments, but in everyday life. Conversations become clearer. Decisions become more intentional. Reactions become responses. And slowly, you realize something important. You're no longer controlled by the moment. You're guiding it, without force, without pressure, without needing recognition, just through awareness. And that's why the final question isn't about what happened in that room. It's not about who stepped forward, who paused longer, or who noticed what. The real question is, what would you do if you were in that position, in that exact moment, with that same pressure? Would you react, or would you remain? Would you try to prove something, or would you understand that nothing needs to be proven because maybe the strongest person in the room isn't the one who wins? It isn't the one who dominates the space, or controls the outcome in a visible way. Maybe it's the one who doesn't need to, the one who stays calm when reaction feels easier, the one who remains steady when pressure tries to create movement, the one who understands that not every moment requires action, and that sometimes the most powerful response is no response at all. So if this perspective feels different, if it made you pause, even for a moment, then you already understand the lesson. Not because it was explained, but because you recognized it. And once you recognize it, you start to see it everywhere, in conversations, in decisions, in moments of pressure that used to feel overwhelming. And each time, you have a choice. Not a loud one, not an obvious one, but an important one, to react or to remain. And in that choice, everything changes.